Hello, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for being here. I see we've got a couple hundred of you in the chat already, so please make sure you've hit the like button and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from, which state, which town, which country. And you guys know I've covered the Assange case for a long time now, as it's gone through the courts in the UK. And I have a very special guest with me today. I have Stella Assange, formerly Stella Morris. She is not only Julian Assange's wife, but also a member of his legal team. And I'm very thrilled to have her with us today. How are you, Stella? How are you doing?
Hi, Richie and everyone. I'm okay. I'm, not too bad.
It's I can see, you're campaigning a lot for Assange, obviously, like 24/7, and I wanted to talk a little bit about the cross appeal process. But before we get into that, I was hoping you could maybe tell us about the very special event that's taking place on October 8th, and there will also be a parallel event in the US, if I got that correct.
Yeah, that's right. Well, let me start with the event. So this is a human chain that we are going to form around the UK Parliament. So the Palace of Westminster is Big Ben, and that big building that is so emblematic of London. And in order to surround Parliament, we actually have to cross the river because one side faces the Thames.
Right.
So our idea was initially to maybe form a human chain around Belmarsh Prison, where Julian's been for 3.5 years. But it didn't work for various reasons. The regulations around the prison, the fact that it would be able to be disrupted with that excuse before the human chain was even formed, and so on. So we're going to do it around the British Parliament, which is the most visible part of London. And to my surprise, it had never been done before. There's never been a human chain around the UK Parliament, so it's very fitting that it should be about freeing Julian.
Mm-hmm.
And we're expecting thousands of people to come on Saturday, the 8th of October at 1:00. So people are coming from all around Europe and other parts of the world to be part of this, because it will be historic in its own right, but also as a clear show of solidarity and humanity for Julian's release.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think in the US, I know of there will be a similar event in DC, and in Australia, in Melbourne, I think they're going to do surround. Sorry, I can't remember exactly what the landmark is, but it's also highly visible in Melbourne and in other places.
Yeah, I'm just putting up on the screen the poster. So again, everybody who's in London, you guys need to make your way down there to the Houses of Parliament in London, 1 p.m. on October 8th. And again, there's a parallel event taking place in the US, because I know most of the audience are British and American, so that works out perfectly to spread the word and spread the message about this, because it's very, very, very important. And Stella, this case has been going on for a long time now, and I was wondering if you could perhaps just briefly summarize it, in case there's someone who's new, who's watching this, who's maybe not been following. Just briefly explain where we are at right now in terms of the cross appeal and so on.
Right. So Julian was arrested in 2019, on the 11th of April 2019, and he was taken to Belmarsh Prison. And since then, he's been in the prison on remand. So he's not serving a sentence. This is the harshest prison in the UK. It's known as Britain's Guantanamo. And he's been there for 3.5 years while the extradition process proceeds through the courts. Initially, Julian won the case in January 2021, sorry. And then the US appealed, changed the goalposts, and the British court inexplicably went along with it. And so now we're back to a position where to extradite him. In June, the UK Home Secretary approved the extradition. So the UK government's position, although it was the previous UK government, is that they are approving the extradition. And now we're at a stage where Julian's defense has presented its submissions to the High Court, which is the second level court, for an appeal. And there's no automatic right to appeal. So it is possible. I mean, it's shocking to even have this in the horizon, but it is possible that the High Court will refuse to hear an appeal. If it allows an appeal, or if it allows if it hears the appeal, it has to decide which grounds it will hear. So this is a complex case, because it involves, I think, 15 separate legal grounds in relation to the US alone. And then there's also a parallel appeal now against the UK government for approving it. But I wouldn't worry too much about understanding the intricacies of the UK extradition procedure, because it is deliberately quite complex and specialized. I'd say this is a political case, and that's the thing to understand. Julian is facing 175 years for journalism, and the case against him is a paradigm shift in which you are no longer safe if you publish the truth when it involves a state that can instrumentalize a law in such a way that they can put you in prison indefinitely, which is what is happening to Julian and his exposure of US war crimes.
Yeah. And the thing is that up until now we've heard for the last year or so mostly about Julian's health. They focus on technicalities, but we've heard nothing in the court about the CIA spying on him, potentially contemplating assassinating him, all of the violations of his right to a fair trial, his due process. I think the question on a lot of people's minds is: are we finally going to hear about this in court once again? And have some sense of accountability.
Well, we certainly hope so. And these are, the issues of the highest possible public importance in a democracy. Whether whether a person actually has a right to prepare his defense, whether he has a right to life. The UK has so far, as I said, gone along with the extradition of a journalist to the country that has plotted his assassination. Yesterday I was in Liverpool, and I was being asked, how unusual is it that you have all these extremely, shocking revelations about what has been done to Julian, and yet the courts seem not to react, or they've rubber stamped it so far, and it is shocking. It is highly unusual, but just like the prosecution against Julian, what it is attempting to establish a new norm, and the whole spectacle of it, the spectacle of dragging Julian out of the embassy, of putting him in the harshest prison in the UK for years on end, of not allowing him to attend his own hearings, of shackling him and strip searching him, and the 18 charges against him, 175 years in the United States. That is the point of it. The spectacle is the point of it, because Julian is being held up as a deterrent for journalists who take their job seriously. In the appeal that we're preparing for, all of these issues are presented to the court as grounds for appeal. Now, will the court agree to hear them? It's interesting because many of these issues are quite embarrassing to the UK courts.
They are.
And the fact that they overturned the previous decision is shocking in itself. And even Amnesty International said that this was, I can't remember the word they used, but shocking that the UK courts overturned the decision. So, the UK court system is also on trial here.
Yeah. And may I ask what happens if they refuse to allow an appeal? What's the next step after that? Although I'm sure that's obviously not what people want to contemplate now, but legally speaking,
if they refuse to hear an appeal, technically Julian could be extradited within a matter of months. There is this constant uncertainty about what his position is, and if there had been any justice in this case, then Julian wouldn't even have been taken to Belmarsh prison in the first place, and the extradition case itself would have been thrown out from the beginning. So I've come to expect very little of the British courts. There is technically, so far, the possibility to appeal to the European Court of Human Rights, but whether the UK would stay the extradition, would not extradite Julian to the US while the European Court of Human Rights decision was being processed, that's also completely uncertain.
Yeah, it's shocking. I personally, I think they would risk it just because it's so important to please Washington. But I mean, the fact that this is a possibility is incredible.
Well, again and again in this case, there has been Julian's always treated like some kind of exception, or if you look back to 2010, when these Chelsea Manning publications came out, there was kind of a consensus that the US would never try to prosecute Julian. They would never try to extradite Julian. This is just completely fanciful. That's what the common wisdom was, as far
right.
as far as the commentariat was concerned. Of course, constitutional lawyers in the US knew exactly what could happen and what the US government, in fact, has been trying to do and has been contemplating for at least 50 years. And that is to repurpose, well, I say repurpose, but basically use the broad wording of the Espionage Act in such a way that it could be used to undermine the First Amendment. Because, of course, the First Amendment is the gold standard globally on press freedom. No one anywhere has the types of protections on free speech that the US has. Europe is far behind in that respect, and that's for there are different historical circumstances there, right, as well. But the protections in the US are far greater because of this constitutional protection. And that is what the New York Times said. This case strikes at the heart of the First Amendment. You go ahead with this case, and the First Amendment is over. And so, sorry, go ahead.
I didn't want to interrupt at all. I thought it's an excellent point, and I was actually just thinking, because in terms of the appeals process, correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding was that there were two appeals, basically one against the courts and one against the Home Secretary. And if I can just pull up on the screen, we have a new Home Secretary now as part of Liz Truss's cabinet. So it's not Priti Patel anymore on the left. We have Stella Braverman now. And I basically just want to ask very simply, we have a new Home Secretary. Do we have a new position on extraditing Assange, or is it the same?
Well, the new cabinet could definitely revisit the decision by Priti Patel, and Priti Patel, of course, was conflicted because Priti Patel has, and this is publicly known, has close ties to interests that are very hostile to Julian. And in fact, her position as Home Secretary is theoretically a quasi-judicial decision. This is the position, right? Because of course, extraditions are all politics, really. The laws that constrain that allow states to resist extraditions. In the case of the US and the UK, and they have a treaty that was introduced shortly after the 9/11 attacks, it's basically a fast track. But there are grounds to resist an extradition, and Priti Patel was in a position to stop this extradition, and she didn't. And there was a very interesting leak in the Wall Street Journal, I think it was, that shortly after when she took that decision, her office asked the DOJ to publicly praise her for having taken that decision. Now, if this really was a quasi-judicial function, you wouldn't have to praise her, right? It would all be, this is just the way the process works. But she was seeking that praise. The DOJ declined, which is very interesting. But someone did praise her, and that was Mike Pompeo. Mike Pompeo, of course, who was the head of the CIA and during the Trump administration, and who was under his watch. It was under his watch that the CIA was plotting to assassinate Julian. And right. Not only that, but took extremely aggressive measures against Julian that fell short of assassinating him, but nevertheless they were implemented. And so Mike Pompeo praised her for the decision. And 10 days later, lo and behold, Mike Pompeo visits Priti Patel, and they have a photo op together. And this in itself is highly unusual. Mike Pompeo is not a public official anymore. Yes. Priti Patel was at the time, and she was receiving this official from a former administration, which is not exactly, a continuity to in some ways it is, but to the Biden administration at the Home Office. This is, from a protocol perspective, completely inappropriate. That was just 10 days after she took this decision. So Priti Patel was clearly conflicted in relation to Julian and her pre-existing ties to the security establishment, security world. And there's this new Home Secretary, Stella Braverman, who her politics are not far. Let's say she's very much of the same political outlook as Priti Patel, I would say. But this is bigger than that. And you have the Prime Minister of Australia now, who has a different position on this case, which is it's a Labour government, so it's the first time there's a Labour government in for over a decade, and the Australian government since 2010 had been very much in line with the U.S. administration, but the new Prime Minister Albanese, he's at least formally, openly saying that enough is enough, that Julian should be released, that this case has gone on for too long, and that's a real break. So, yes, in some cases, it's down to Priti Patel or Stella Braverman and so on, but really, this case can be solved at the highest level.
Yeah, my next question was actually about the new Australian government, because the new Foreign Minister Penny Wong, and as you mentioned, the new Prime Minister Anthony Albanese. My understanding, at least before they got into office, was that they were quite outspoken about getting Julian Assange freed. He is, after all, an Australian citizen. And now, once they're in office, I believe the tone has changed slightly. Did I get that correctly?
Well, they say that they're not going to conduct their bilateral relations with a loudhailer, and that
right, that was the phrase. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's not how you achieve results. Frankly, I don't care how they achieve results. I want the results achieved, and so far they have failed because Julian is not free yet. And that's ultimately how their position on this will be measured, because of course the Australian government is and has always been in a position to free Julian. It's just a matter of political will.
I used to hear a claim from the former Australian government. They said that they were providing Julian with consular support, and I wanted to ask you if that claim is true, and if Julian is getting any consular support now from the new government.
Well, consular support is the kind of thing like, you lose your passport, and then the consulate sorts out some solution where you can get back home and pay back, in a reasonable time the expense that they went through, that kind of thing. And for nationals who are in prison, it's things like interfacing with the bureaucracy in order to ensure that you get medical assistance, or you get your glasses delivered, or that kind of thing. That's not what Julian needs. What Julian needs is diplomatic support, and everyone knows this. If you have a national in a Libyan prison like Australia had, in relation to one of Julian's lawyers, actually, they didn't provide consular support. They provided diplomatic support, and they ensured that she was freed. And the same thing with an Australian academic who was in Iran, and so on. That's what you do. And this consular support is a cynical excuse to say, well, we're not treating him differently. And in fact, the former Prime Minister, Bob Carr, he wrote a book after he left office in Australia, and he said that he had made some statements about how Julian was treated exactly like any other Australian citizen would. And then in his book, he admitted that wasn't true. And in fact, Bob Carr has become one of the strong supporters for Julian's release, as have other former prime ministers and foreign ministers of Australia. There's a very unanimous, I'd say, support for his release among recent heads of state and so on in Australia. But sorry, I lost my train of thought.
Well, I think it's a great point you brought up, because when they say consular support, it gives the impression that it's diplomatic support. But
yeah, no, exactly. But I mean, it goes further than that. Like, just so this is Australia, and it might seem bizarre to countries who, who have, like the UK and the United States, where there's this kind of thing would be unthinkable. Okay, so the Australian High Commissioner, it's called. It's like the Australian ambassador in the UK. He used to be the head of the the DIA, I think it would be, like the intelligence services in Australia. And then he became Australian ambassador. He's no longer here. He got replaced with the new government. But up to a few months ago, it was him. And he was the one, right, that was responsible for Julian, and formally. And this guy, his name slips my mind, but when he was also Attorney General in Australia, and when he was Attorney General during a Senate hearing, he appeared wearing CIA cufflinks. And,
Wow.
and you know, this isn't a rumor. There were articles about it. And he's even been photographed with his CIA cufflinks while he was sitting as High Commissioner here in the UK. The Australian High Commission, the embassy, tweeted a picture of him wearing his CIA cufflinks. Now, the CIA, of course, is the agency that was plotting to assassinate Julian. And this information came out while he was ambassador, while he was ambassador in London, and while he was, you know, it was being plotted as he was sitting ambassador. So you really have to. It makes you very cynical about. This is a person who's, you know, supposed to be directing the support
Wow.
for Julian in Belmarsh prison, but also. There were some consular visits initially when Julian was taken to Belmarsh prison, and as his nearest and dearest, Julian's father and mother were given access to the notes that with Julian's permission, that the embassy had taken from the visits. And they had misrepresented what he had said. And similarly, like the Australian government has been observing the proceedings in London, but they don't have a human rights representative observing the proceedings, someone who's specialized in human rights. The person they have observing the proceedings is someone who used to work. Well, he's a lawyer, but he used to work on security issues and intelligence issues. That's the guy they send. And even those reports have misrepresented what the defense has said. At one point, one of those reports reported something that the prosecution had said, that the U.S. argued, as if that was what the defense had said. So, you know, at that level, the Australian embassy and representation here in London has not been looking out for Julian's interests for very long. And you know, Julian, it's simply not true that Julian has refused consular assistance. He simply said that the consular assistance can be managed through his lawyers, and in fact, things that he has asked for from the Australian government, like originally in 2012, to obtain a guarantee that Sweden and the US would not extradite him, they didn't do. So, you know, there's a game that's being played and has been played for many years by Australia to try to justify themselves and cover their tracks. But of course, again, this isn't about consular assistance or what the embassy in London does or doesn't do. This is about the Australian government actually doing what is needed, doing whatever it takes to get Julian home.
Right, and like you said, there are many examples of Australian citizens where they actually did support them. I think, if I'm not mistaken, is his name George Brandis? Because I've just pulled up the picture with the CIA cufflinks, and it's really amazing.
Brandis.
I don't know if people can see them properly, but down here, I'll just try and get the logo up there. But it's really something else. I mean, seeing that, honestly. Yeah, there. I think you can see the cufflinks now. Wow, he's not hiding it.
He's doing it on purpose. He's signaling, and it might seem like completely, utterly bizarre, but you have to understand what kind of relationship Australia has with the United States. And recently there was a statement by, well, I can't remember by who in the Australian government. There was talk about, I think the term was shared sovereignty.
Wow.
At the, these are the Five Eyes, right? This is Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the US, and the UK. And they are, in a sense, they're like one state. The security state is completely merged, and they've done this in order to escape their own laws, in order to be able to spy on each other's citizens and then share that information with each other in a way so they're not breaking their own laws when they're spying, when they receive intelligence about their own citizens. This is a trick they've been playing for years, and came out of the so-called war on terror. But that means that at that level, the states have merged, and so you think, well, if we're not dealing with a kind of state subject relationship, what are we moving into? Like, your citizens are losing their standing in relation to their own government when their own government is no longer a part of a single state, but part of something larger, that is operating in the shadows, that even the traditional checks and balances are not in control of, and don't even have a clear picture of.
Yeah, absolutely shocking, of course, and as you eloquently put it, it's really a single state. I think it's a perfect way to describe it. And I suppose this is a rhetorical question now, but I saw that the Australian Prime Minister Albanese came to the UK for the Queen's funeral. I gather he did not meet with King Charles or Liz Truss or US President Joe Biden, who was also there, to talk about freeing Assange in any capacity.
You never know. I want to give Albanese the benefit of my hope that he can solve the situation, because in some ways it's probably Julian's only hope that Albanese strives to deliver on this. And I nothing is served by me being utterly cynical about it. And I think it's possible that he can pull it off. I think he wants to, and he certainly can. There's a lot of pressure in Australia. The general Australian population is completely on side on this. They want Julian to come home. Julian's a hero in Australia. For some years, the kind of smears that were being seeded in order to secure his arrest were aired and so on in Australia, but that stopped, and the voices that are hostile to Julian in Australia are very rare, and he has enormous support, as I said, from recent former prime ministers and foreign ministers and so on, very high level establishment support in Australia. So in terms of the domestic dynamics, Albanese would definitely benefit from freeing Julian, and that gives me a lot of hope.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've seen they have a cross-party parliamentary group, not just in Australia, by the way, but particularly in Australia, which is very supportive of Julian right across the board. So can I ask you, Stella, how is Julian? How is he doing?
Well, the longer he's in prison, the worse his health gets. And in October, he suffered a mini stroke. You can just imagine the type of stress that Julian is under, in addition to the physical deterioration that that is involved if for a person being imprisoned indefinitely, especially because Julian wasn't free before he went into Belmarsh.
Yeah.
He was in the Ecuadorian embassy, which is not a big space. It's a flat in central London with no outside space, no fresh air, and so on. He was there for 7 years. So Julian's health had already deteriorated by the time he went into Belmarsh prison, and on top of the physical deterioration, there is the torture of being subjected to this kind of inhumane treatment. The UN Special Rapporteur on Torture investigated Julian's case. He's written a book about it. He's called Niels Meltzer, and it's a very interesting book because he was one of these people who was very skeptical of Julian to begin with, and who didn't want to get involved in this case, and had heard all the smears and believed them, and then ultimately realized that he had a duty to at least read the documents that had been presented to him, and then immediately the scales fell from his eyes, and he understood that he had been manipulated and propagandized, and that his perception about the case was not at all what it was. And then he wrote a book about the case, and it is the most sophisticated breakdown from the Swedish allegations to where we are now. So he concluded, having done his initial investigation with 2 forensic psychiatrists, top of their field, obviously, this is the UN we're talking about. They visited Julian, and they concluded that Julian had been subjected to psychological torture, and that he was at a very severe risk because of the situation, the indefinite nature, the arbitrariness, and so on. And this was already in 2019. So Julian is an extremely resilient, strong person, and he knows he has huge support. He knows his case is extremely strong, or should be in a fair court. So he has many reasons to fight on, and he has obviously me and the kids. So he has the support structure, of the family and of the broader community supporting him, and there are many people who are fighting for him. And he obviously draws strength from these things. But any person would find it extremely difficult to be in the situation that he's in for 1 day, a week, a month, let alone years. And there's only so much a human being can take. So even though he's fighting on, and there are some weeks that are more difficult than others, his health is at risk of a catastrophic failure at any point, because and this is something I didn't really have a proper understanding of, as someone who hadn't really had much contact, or any contact, frankly, with the prison estate. That you think of prison, you think of, well, the isolation. There's a lot of things that you imagine about prisons because you've seen them on Prison Break or whatever. It's not at all like that. At least Belmarsh, what Julian's going through. There are no lunchtime, you get together with the other prisoners and so on. You eat in your cell. You're in your cell all the time. The interactions with other people are very few. And Belmarsh is a high security prison with people who are passing through all the time. So you can't really develop relationships with people. People are taken away all of a sudden. One of the people Julian had developed a friendship with committed suicide during the COVID lockdown. It's an extremely dangerous and depressing place in itself. And Julian is fighting the most important press freedom battle. He's fighting for his life in a very complex case. which the US has been able to prepare for a decade in secret.
Yep.
And he's fighting it with his hands tied behind his back, where the prison bureaucracy interferes in all sorts of ways. Like, for example, the US issued a second superseding indictment. They did this, it was outrageous, and they keep on doing this. They change the goalposts of the case all the time. So Julian's extradition case started in, I think, February 2020. He was arrested in April 2019. The case started in February 2020. And then there was a recess of a couple of weeks, and then COVID hit. And so the rest of the hearing was moved to September. Now, in June, I think it was the 28th of June, the US issues a new superseding indictment. And they posted on the website, the DOJ website, with their press release, which, by the way, journalists, they just read the press release. So whenever, you always have to educate them, like, oh yeah, you read the press release. Well, it doesn't really say that, right? Have you actually read the indictment? But you can't, they don't like that being said. So it's a bit delicate, but they all read the press release. And so the world could read the indictment if they actually had the time and dedication and interest. Venture to say that many people who are not journalists actually did that. And some good journalists did. Julian didn't read it for 10 days because that's how long it took for the indictment to be brought through the prison system into Julian's hands. He didn't even know what this indictment said. I mean, apart from what I could, what could be read to him over the phone, on time-constrained phone calls. This is the reality of fighting a case from Belmarsh prison. That's what we're talking about. And this is an indictment that was issued halfway through the extradition hearing. And then the US didn't say how it was going to be incorporated until about basically, okay, so the US issues an indictment. And then you have the extradition case. And then, you have the UK lawyers saying, both sides saying, well, we don't really know what this means for the case. Like, is it new allegations, or they incorporate, and so they didn't actually say. And then when they did finally say, they said, oh, this is all just context, but it's new context. And then we weren't allowed to issue submit evidence to counter that new context, because Berater didn't allow it. So, okay, that's what Julian's dealing with. Quite apart from his loved ones and, our little children who are 3 years old and 5 years old, we can visit him, but, they're depriving him of his being a father, of being, able to be there for our kids. And all of these things are, things that Julian has to deal with. So how is he? It depends on the day. It depends on, the circumstance. It depends on, the whims of the prison guards. And if they've had a bad day, because, in prison, you have no agency whatsoever. You're you're completely unable to decide, when you go to the yard.
Right.
If you go to the yard, he might be on the phone and someone knocks on his door, and if they don't hear him answer or whatever, they think, well, he's on the phone, he's not going to go out or whatever. So it's just a completely dehumanizing place to be. And he's been there for 3.5 years, and he's fighting. And, he's not okay. It's hell. But he's fighting.
Yeah, it's like you said. I think it would be, one day, 1 week would be tough for anyone. Never mind all these years. And you reminded me of this period, right, where the lockdown hit, and I think Julian, he couldn't see his lawyers for 6 months, something like that. And you mentioned this alleged conduct which they added in the second indictment. David Mendoza, whose case you cited in court, and I then published this article about his case with the supporting documents. he was actually very scared of this and told me that in the U.S. prison system, they use the conduct to basically, add on more years. So I think he got 6 years, Mendoza, and then it turned into 14 just because of the conduct, which is outrageous. I mean, if you consider in Julian's case that, just with the charges alone, it's 175 years. I mean, does that mean if he gets convicted on 2 counts, for example, it could turn from 20 to 30 years? It's unpredictable how they were going to use this against him, right?
Well, that second superseding indictment, it's simply just incredible. As I said, it's changing the goalposts, and clearly the U.S. They have this thing that you often see reported. Oh, well, the U.S. says if he's extradited, he'd probably get 4 years. This is completely ridiculous. That's basically, you have plea deals in cases involving whistleblowers in the U.S. That have had low sentences. But clearly, the parallel that you should be looking at is Chelsea Manning, who got 35, and who, by the way, was facing about 130 years. Julian, who was the publisher of the Manning leaks, faces 175. And of course, Chelsea Manning's sentence was commuted by Obama. So that second superseding indictment, I think, was a desperate move by the U.S. And it came, as I said, after halfway through the extradition hearings, and it concerns the computer intrusion charge. And that computer intrusion charge was completely obliterated by the defense witness, Patrick Eller, who had been the top forensic analyst in the U.S. military on computer forensics. So he left the military, and then he was a witness for this, and he took it apart. And he said, what the U.S. is alleging is technically impossible. Like, this could not have been the purpose. This could not have been what was going on, because it's technically nonsense. And so it was after that witness had been heard in February that the U.S. then, kind of, I think, in a desperate move, thought, well, we have to beef up this computer charge. This is the 5-year charge. Out of the 175 years, 5 years concerns a computer charge. And it was always a extremely shaky charge, because the initial FBI statement by an FBI agent, I forget her name, said, that the evidence is circumstantial. This is just some theory that they've cooked up without understanding the technology, and then they needed a charge. They desperately needed to find something, and the Obama administration had already looked at the evidence, and they said, Julian Assange is not a hacker. That's what Matthew Miller, the DOJ spokesperson, said. He's a publisher. And if we charge Assange, then we are setting a precedent against the rest of the press, and we're not prepared to do that. That's what the Obama administration said explicitly. And so this computer charge was just a PR maneuver, and the press, the mainstream press, fell for it, because it was the initial charge that came out. There was a single charge, 5 years, Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. And even when Julian was arrested and it was revealed that there was a charge in the US, the UK judge even said, why are you even resisting the extradition? Why don't you just go and deal with it there? 5 years, and then after a month, the other 17 charges came down under the Espionage Act. And it was just, it's just a way to try to distract from the Espionage Act. But you just have to look at the relative weight of the different charges. This is an Espionage Act case, and the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act charge is there to kind of try to put in a wedge and say, well, it's not really about, it has some kind of computer component, so don't worry about it.
Yeah, I remember the IT experts coming in and obliterating this, saying that, that when it comes to the rainbow tables, the hash and everything, it's just all of this was, technically impossible, and then at best circumstantial when it comes to supposedly Assange hacking anything. It's like you said, it's really just about character assassination, about kind of putting this in people's minds that he's not a journalist, he's something else, and they're, that's a really, like you said, a PR maneuver.
Well, the U.S. allegation is that Julian and Manning entered a conspiracy to try to hide Manning's identity. That is what the U.S. says was the purpose of this alleged conversation. And it's not even, these are chats between anonymous accounts. There's no explanation of what the purpose is, so it's just a hypothesis. And it's not about cracking a password, it's about cracking a hash. So, there are all sorts of difficulties when you're trying to explain. These are foreign concepts, right? Even to the lawyers involved, there's highly technical nuance involved, and that's why Eller's testimony was so important. But even the U.S. government doesn't say that this was to get information, because the reality is that Chelsea Manning, when this alleged conversation happened, had already submitted the vast majority of the leaks.
Right.
They were already in possession of WikiLeaks. And so even from that perspective, it doesn't make sense. Like hiding her identity when 3 out of 4 or something of the leaks had already been submitted. It doesn't really make sense. But anyway, so yeah, I mean, the hypothesis is ludicrous, and so what they did is then they beefed up this computer charge by relying on the testimony of a convicted fraudster in Iceland who had defrauded WikiLeaks and had gone to prison, and who had also served prison multiple convictions for sexual abuse of minors. And this person, his name is Thordarson.
Right.
He was subsequently interviewed by the Icelandic media in a long-ranging piece, and he recanted his testimony and said that what's in this latest indictment, the one that is currently in play, is false. That's not at all what happened. So the U.S. Is misleading the British courts, and it's just so incredible that they're. I know that the U.S. In the U.S. There's a kind of pretty outrageous practice with forcing plea deals and so on.
Yeah.
But they're playing dirty now in the British courts, and the British courts are going along with it, even though it's just so plain for everyone to see that this is, they're like exporting their dirty practices into the British court system, and that also creates precedent here. That if this kind of playing with the rules, changing the goalposts, introducing a new indictment that you can't contest, with evidence that is there, then the whole thing becomes a farce.
Yeah, it's very shady, and I think you talk about them misleading the courts. I mean, I was just in the High Court alone when they ruled that they accept these assurances. I was shocked because the legal team had cited so many cases, Hamza, Mendoza, just showing that you can't trust these things, and they still believe them. I couldn't understand the judge's reasoning, and I've went through it multiple times, and it seems like almost like they accept that, yes, if you read the diplomatic note given by the Americans, they never really violate it because they never promised not to do XYZ, therefore it's not a violation. I mean,
I think that the way to understand these things, I think, is shifting the blame. Can they get away with it? Can the UK courts get away with accepting these assurances? And the US government provided an excuse, in spite of the findings of the medical experts, that Julian was highly likely to be driven to suicide if he's extradited, and that the evidence shows that he's highly likely to be held in isolation, the type of isolation that would kill him. How do they get away with that? Well, the US formulates assurances in a way that lets the UK courts off the hook. This is the game that is being played constantly. And the game that is being played, we're talking about highly sophisticated methods that have been developed, not just against Julian, but in order to game the system. And it's shocking, frankly, that the UK courts allowed it. And the interesting thing about that is that the US assurances, they were never made public. It's interesting what they leak and what they don't leak. So they published the superseding indictment, they put out the press release. The assurances themselves were never given to the press. They came out as a result of the challenging the assurances. The wording, once that was public, was clear, and basically what those assurances did was not the US government was not removing its ability to do something in those assurances. What it did was allow itself to put Julian in under the treatment, the very treatment that had blocked the extradition. So what it said is, if Julian's extradited, he won't be put in isolation unless we decide that he should. And we decide if he should. The agency involved in deciding are that the security agencies, the NSA, the CIA, the agency that plotted to assassinate him. And it's not like there's an effective oversight over that, because they can just say, this is national defense. We can't really disclose it to the other side. We have our reasons and so on. So the assurances were licensing the US government to put Julian in conditions that would kill him and would torture him to death. And the UK courts just overturned the decision and said, well, deference to the relationship between the two countries. These are, the US, they like to say, has a the rule of law, and there are all sorts of safeguards. And so we cannot second guess that. And we tried to appeal that decision because it was frankly just a travesty, as that was what Amnesty said. It was a travesty of justice, because the protection from torture is the strongest protection that exists in international law. It is a peremptory norm of international law, that you just, there under no circumstances can you be placed in can you be tortured. There's just and the US was saying, well, if we think Assange did something or does something that we think justifies that torturous treatment, then we can do it. And the UK court said, okay, that's what happened. And so the Supreme Court refused to hear our appeal on that point, because I think it was so obvious that Julian, that this was a shocking decision, and they simply didn't want it heard.
Yeah, and you know, I recall with Mendoza, he actually not only got assurances, but a written and signed contract, which you would think is supposed to be more ironclad. They still violated it. I mean, I cannot I expect the U.S. courts to play foul with Julian, especially if it's an espionage case in secret. But I guess I'm surprised, but also not really surprised that the High Court in the UK bought the US argument here. I don't know how they got past that. It's just incredible to me. It's absolutely shocking, really.
It's a huge embarrassment for the UK, and you know, the problem with these kind of egregious cases is that the system becomes kind of complicit in it, because if
Right.
it starts recognizing its own, that it let this reach this point, then there's eventually some kind of reckoning, and it's just easier to just keep going along with it. But I think it's just hugely embarrassing to the UK, that the spectacle that they're involved in is hugely embarrassing, and it's embarrassing also from an international perspective. So sometimes you think, well, maybe in less high-profile cases where no one's paying attention, they can get away with it. They can't get away with this. It's just they will never get away with this. And part of what I'm trying to do, as probably the most visible part of Julian's campaign, is to highlight this, that the UK is never going to get away with this. And they have to stop, because the cost of keeping on going is higher to them, and they have to stop this now.
Stella, you retweeted an art project by Salon Rogue, and I just wanted to put this up quickly on the screen. It's a recreation of Julian's cell, and just very briefly, I mean, is it accurate? It looks quite bleak, to put it very, very mildly. So this is basically daily life for Julian, correct?
Well, this is an art exhibition in Leipzig, so there's some artistic license there. The dimensions are accurate. Julian has one chair, a toilet, a bed, and that's a space. I think the most, it's really important for people to actually try to sit in the space. Try to find a room that is that big and sit in there for 20 minutes, an hour, 2 hours a day, and picture what it's like for Julian. Because I think it's hard to imagine, being Julian in many ways, or having gone through what he's going through. But that is a very effective way to just going down to basics and understanding what his day-to-day life is like. And I think it's really important that they did that. And he's there for 21, 22 hours a day. There have been days where he's been there 24 hours during the COVID period, when there was an outbreak in his wing. He's alone in the cell, and he can call me most days, but still, I mean, that's he wouldn't even have that in the United States. He, if he's placed under SAMS, which is the thing that the U.S. government says they can do, or under any other form of solitary confinement, which, as you know, there's on any given day, the US has about an estimated 80,000 people under conditions of solitary confinement. They call them different things, under different terms. They don't say you're in solitary confinement. They call it different things. But if he's placed under SAMS, which is the most extreme form of isolation, only about 50 people in the US are under these conditions, then he's only allowed to speak to his family once or twice a month for 15 minutes. So even though this condition in Belmarsh is very difficult, there's just no comparison with what Julian would face in the United States. And I have to say, like in Belmarsh, I mean, you have a few people who are not this way, but there are, I'd say the vast majority of prisoners and prison guards are aware that Julian is a political prisoner and that he has no, he shouldn't be there. And I'm not saying he has any privileges, but this awareness certainly impacts the way, the way he's perceived there. And in the United States, it would be a completely different situation in Virginia.
Yeah. And as you correctly mentioned, SAMS would be much worse. And of course, I've highlighted before, as has the legal team in court, that you have other things like CMUs, communication management units, special housing units, SHUs. They can cook up a bunch of, a wider array of isolating conditions. And yeah, it would be very daunting. Stella, I wanted to ask you very frankly, what can people watching do to help? I'm just going to highlight, of course, the event, of course, taking place again. This is 1 p.m. On Saturday, October 8th at the Houses of Parliament. There will be a huge, huge human chain. So please come down there if you're able to and take part to support Julian Assange, to fight for press freedoms. And there will be also an event taking place simultaneously in the US. Is there anything else that people can do to help, Stella?
Oh, well, there are events happening all the time. So, and I can't even keep track of them. So, I don't know where people are who are watching. I'd say get in touch with your local Assange support group. If there is none, then start one. The Human Chain in London. So I'm going to be there, and a bunch of friends and thousands of other people I don't know, but I mean, lots of interesting people will be there, and that's an opportunity for all of us to come together. You can sign up. You don't have to sign up, but you can sign up on don'textraditeassange.com, and then we can send emails with updates about like some of the practicalities. But if you don't do that, 1 o'clock in front of Parliament, you'll find us there on the 8th, which is a Saturday. As you said, there's a art exhibition in Leipzig. There's also another art exhibition coming up in Berlin that opens, I think, on the 7th of October. I might be wrong about the date, 6th or 7th or so. And will go on for about 2 or 3 weeks with different events. And I'm probably going to be at that as well. And, there are very strong support groups throughout the US, local ones as well. And in Australia, and things are happening on different levels all the time. Roger Waters has been touring, has been touring throughout the U.S. with a show of collateral murder and these big screens saying "Free Assange" in front of crowds of tens of thousands of people. So that's quite amazing. So it's really, this is the cause of our lifetime. This is really a no-brainer. I was just speaking, I was in Liverpool. There was the Labour conference there, and I was speaking to a lot of people, and I've definitely noticed a shift, even among, I'd say, people who move in very mainstream circles, that this is, someone said, this is the obvious campaign. And this is like quite an interesting realization for me, that this is the perception now. This is the obvious campaign, and it affects everything really, because it goes to the core of whether we are really living in a system that tolerates journalism at its strongest, true journalism, whether it tolerates dissent, whether these safeguards are just completely undermined for good. And this is a defining case of our times. Like other cases have been defining of their times, this is the one that is defining of ours.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I urge everyone, if you can, if you're in the UK, please make it down to London, Parliament Square, Saturday, October 8th, 1 p.m. If you're in the US, there'll also be a simultaneous event happening there on October 8th to form a human chain. And Stella, again, I know you're working tirelessly around the clock with countless others to campaign for Julian's release. And again, thank you for your time and for coming on. It's been a pleasure speaking, even though the subject matter is not, of course, the happiest, but it's important to get this out there, as we all know, and to shine light on this issue. So I appreciate you coming on very much. Thank you.
I'm really happy to have been here, and thanks for all your work, Richie.
Of course. Thank you very much, everybody. That was Stella Assange. She is the wife of WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange, who is being charged with the Espionage Act in the United States for publishing documents that expose war crimes in Afghanistan, Iraq, and the Guantanamo Bay files as well. The State Department cables, countless precious, invaluable journalistic endeavors that many mainstream outlets used to win prizes, to print very important stories and win accolades, prizes or otherwise. And so it's very important to highlight this case and to fight for it. And this is something that everybody can do. Go participate in the human chain on October 8th. Thank you very much, Stella. And thank you to everyone for tuning in. I see we've got a couple of thousand people watching, so please make sure you've hit the like button and please share the video. It helps a lot, and we can educate people that way. Thank you very much, everybody. Bye-bye.